All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's workshop, which is entitled Assessing Language Learning with LinguaGrow. This workshop is sponsored by the Arabic Teachers Council of Washington, D.C., and that council is administered through the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University, where I'm based. And it's made possible by a generous grant from Qatar Foundation International. So we're very lucky to have two great speakers today. We have Dr. Julie Sykes and Mr. Tigre Lusardi from the University of Oregon. So they're joining us from a few hours behind DC. I guess, you know, everybody here is probably in different time zones. So I was going to say good morning, good afternoon, but wherever you are, hello and welcome. I'm just going to introduce them quickly and then give them the floor. I will just note really briefly that after the workshop is over, I'll be sure to send you all a brief survey, and would be great if you could fill it out. It's just 3 questions. So anyway, just wanted to do a plug for that. So first, Dr. Julie Sykes, she earned her Ph.D. from the University of Minnesota. She's the director of the Center for Applied Second Language Studies and an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on applied linguistics and second language acquisition, with an emphasis on technological and pedagogical innovation for interlanguage pragmatic development and intercultural competence. She's taught courses on second language teaching and learning, methodology and research, language learning and technology, Hispanic linguistics, and interlanguage pragmatic development. And Tigre Lusardi has a master's degree. He's a research assistant on the curriculum team at the center, also at the Center for Applied Second Language Studies at the University of Oregon. He completed his MA in language teaching studies at the university there and holds a BA in music and Italian language and literature from Smith College. That sounds great. It sounds really interesting. His research focuses on increasing learner awareness of L1 and L2 pragmatics and building learner facility and agency and using L2 pragmatics in context. All right, Dr. Julie and Tigre, you have the floor, and thank you so much for being with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for having us and sharing your time with us on what we know is a very, very busy time of life for all educators all over the world, really. We are delighted to be here, and we are talking about assessing language learning, not only testing language learning, not only grading language learning, right? But how do we use LinguaGrow or LinguaFolio online, if you're familiar with that, LinguaGrow being sort of its new name as we're transitioning, and an e-portfolio system to drive assessment and work on those pieces. We have 2 goals today. We kind of have a 1-hour goal and a 2-hour goal, and we'll see how the time goes and just kind of follow through as people sort of meet their needs as well. For the first hour, we're hoping to look at identifying best practices associated with LinguaGrow or an e-portfolio more broadly, if you don't use that particular platform. Discuss the link between grading and LinguaGrow and student reflection, et cetera, and then articulate a plan for implementation based on what fits for you. We have a huge variety of levels of teachers, right? We have all the way from elementary school through higher ed. And so those implementation plans become really different. What we know are the best practices sort of can stay standard across the board. It's how we implement them that really matters. In hour 2, our hope is we'll dive into just reflective practice and goal setting as related to evidence from the classroom and how valuable that can be, and then identifying some approaches involving learners in the goal setting process. So our hope is really that you walk away with something you could use, you know, next week or next term, next semester, depending on sort of how you want to implement that. And then we will explain best practices associated with providing feedback for learners as we go. Hopefully those goals sound worthwhile and useful to you. If you have any additional goals or why you're here, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll try to at least mention some examples as we go along, so you can be sure to, you know, the goal is that this is useful for everyone involved in some way, right, as we go. All right. Any other goals that we're missing that you would like? Feel free. We're pretty small groups. You're welcome to also chime in as you see fit. All right, so let's dive into hour one. This is our first hour together. We'll take a short break in the middle also. So Zoom fatigue, right, is a real thing. We're tired of those squares. So if we can give you a break, that is absolutely our goal also. And we'll really start thinking about what those best practices look like, diving into this. And so with that, I will turn this over to Tigre. And Tigre, just let me know when you're ready for me to switch the slides as we're going. The sound isn't working? You're completely frozen. All right, no problem. I will dive in, maybe jump out and jump back in. I will keep going and we'll see when he gets back to us. So why LinguaGrow? What's happening here? How's it going? That was some good gesturing as we got technical difficulties. Some of the research and what it tells us in particular. And so we have a number of studies that have looked at this issue empirically when we're talking about grading and student achievement. One of probably the most cited and with the largest number of students is from 2013, et al. And what they found in this research was that there is a significant relationship between growth and goal setting ability and growth in language achievement. Learners who set short-term and long-term goals with can-do statements had higher language proficiency scores. In this case, they used STAMP. And extending that study also had higher scores in other disciplines. And so when we're talking about assessing language learning, what we want to do is start at the beginning and go all the way through from reflective goal setting to these sort of high stakes tests. And what they found was that the more we engage in the type of learning and assessment and feedback that happens through something like LinguaGrow, the better outcomes that we found. And so this has been true across a whole variety of contexts and with different ages, and it tells us something about how we want to implement. And so when we're going through these different stages today, and we're talking about grading and assessment with portfolios and this work, what we know is this is the most key lesson for implementation is that training learners in reflective cycles is critical for success. That means giving them very clear articulated goals, in this case, smarter goals, if we want to call that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, evaluative, with a reflection process and revisiting those goals consistently. That can be daily, that can be weekly, but the ultimate goal is they should be able to, in some ways, grade themselves. That's not true in terms of grammar correction. It's not true in terms of the key sort of language pieces, but when we're talking about overall proficiency and attaching sort of goals to particular functions, it gives them a chance to do that and really dive in. Another study sort of did the same thing, and they added systematic kind of self-regulation. And so they talked to learners about how to learn, and same results. We found that there was higher value placed on in-classroom tasks. Then that is revisiting these 4 to 7 times. And so the data really tells us that these reflective cycles work, although they do take time. So one of the biggest barriers that we see can be the absence of sort of focus. We get busy, we have tons of stuff to cover in our lesson, or there's a behavior thing, there's something that goes on. And so it becomes tricky. And so when we think about implementation, we can take these results and tell us 3 things. One, really define what regular means. For elementary level learners, that might mean every day, something like a smiley face that they work with when they're talking about language. How did I feel about my Arabic today? How do I feel about it tomorrow? If we're talking about higher ed learners, maybe it's a weekly reflection where they're like, did I meet these particular learning target goals? And making sure that you stick to that plan. I think one of the most challenging things for me in my own language classes is, we're on this really cool discussion and we miss the reflective practice for the week. And then to get that started again becomes really tricky. And so once it's embedded in your practice, and we'll talk a lot about different techniques for doing that, you can start to see this as a way to give regular feedback, regular assessment, regular grading, not only to the products they're producing, but their learning processes as a whole, which then give meaning to the learning that's happening. And what we see from the data, stronger learning outcomes and better language skills, right? Which is ultimately what our goal is, better language all the way around.
Julie, I'm back if you would like me to hop back.
All right, Tigre, I will turn the last one over to Tigre and let him finish.
And thank you for rolling with that, Julie. As
yeah, no
we
problem.
all know, using technology comes with its own set of skills and possible foibles and flexibility, right? So both our LinguaGrow platform and how we use it is built to be flexible and applicable to a wide variety of classroom or out of the classroom settings. And we all, as evidenced by the fact that I could not get my Zoom to work, flexibility and a good sense of humor is very useful in implementing these things. So our last study that we'll talk about here is a dissertation written through the University of Nebraska in sort of a high school and post-secondary settings. So we looked specifically, or this researcher looked at Linguafolio students and their ACT scores, so their standardized testing scores, and also their GPAs. And what was found was that both those ACT scores and GPAs for students who used Linguafolio regularly as a part of their program were higher than for those who did not. So again, here, we can't necessarily show causation between those two things, but what it does show us is that use of reflective practice does help out across the board with learning outcomes in terms of both standardized scores and proficiency levels. So lessons for implementation from this is the purpose is not only to document language learning, but we're really promoting the development of critical thinking and learning skills, goal setting skills that are applicable both in language learning and in every other aspect of learning that students are doing. LinguaGrow is also successful in promoting self-regulation. So that is when students understand what they need to do and how to achieve it with their language learning goals. And like I said, can positively impact all learning. So really that reflective practice, that consistency of practice reflects learning both for language classrooms and outside of language classroom. So next. Okay, so additional benefits of using LinguaGrow. Using LinguaGrow helps shift an orientation away from mastery of specific skills. So can I conjugate these verbs? What does my penmanship in Arabic look like? Can I spell words correctly? Things like that, towards a proficiency model. So what can I do with the language that I know? It also helps unlock the learning process. Again, that reflective piece helps students understand how to set goals and work towards those goals, implement strategies in working towards those goals. And it facilitates a growth mindset for learners and learners empowerment. So it really is aimed to get learners actively engaged in their language learning process. What do I want to do with Arabic? Where do I want to go? How can I prove what I know how to do? And then how do I get to my next goals? Next. Okay, so there were also a variety of pilot studies done with Linguafolio, now LinguaGrow. Next, we'll go over those. The context for these was a wide variety of contexts. There were rural and urban secondary schools in the Pacific Northwest, elementary schools in the Northeast, intensive summer programs, statewide implementation targeted at grades 6 through 12, and then also self-study contexts, specifically in post-secondary environments. So this tool was piloted with a wide variety of teachers, of students, of contexts, in order to see, does it really work across all of these things? If I am teaching in an elementary or middle school, can I use this tool in ways that are beneficial to my classroom and to my learners? And then if I'm teaching in a high school or post-secondary context, is that the same? Can this tool be used in all of those contexts and adapted well for all of those contexts? Next. And the outcomes of these pilot studies are fivefold. So first, do what you can well. So set yourself up with specific goals, smarter goals. And the next, you have to introduce the why of LinguaGrow to learners. So again, going back to that piece with learner empowerment, if they know why they're using this tool, that helps them engage with it and be more likely to see what the benefit is to them, to their learning process, to working towards their goals. Another thing that is important is introducing proficiency levels to learners. So this tool is tied specifically to the Necessful Actful proficiency levels and can-do statements, which make it very easy for learners to see where they are, what they can do with language at their current level, and then what would it take to go to the next level, the next goal. It is useful to give learners opportunity to complete practice tasks. So these can be sort of gamified if you want. You can do races to set up their accounts, to upload evidence on an assignment, to edit their profile, to add the languages they're studying. Anything you can do to engage learners with sort of setting up and interacting with the platform helps them become more familiar with it, and will help them be able to engage with it more easily as time goes on. And then include reflection in class all the time. So again, that's really the key of this, using this kind of tool, right, is the reflection piece. You really want to build that into your class as much as possible, and that will ensure that learners are using the tool in ways that benefit them the most. There's a whole list of here how to do it. A couple of ideas are doing exit tickets at the end of sessions, seeing how learners asking a question for learners to fill out as they leave the classroom, doing the fist to 5. So how familiar or how well do you think you can do this? Fist being 0, can't really do it at all. 5 being like, I got this. This is something I can do really, really well, really easily. Wong-Baker pain rating scale, very similar. You're probably familiar with that from medical settings. So the lowest one is someone who is very much in pain and unhappy, and then the highest one being someone who's not in pain, and I might have switched those around. Anyway, one end of the scale, very much in pain, the other end of the scale, no pain at all. And we're using those visual images of faces. Where are students along that scale? That can be great for lower level learners, using those visual images of faces to help them mark how they're feeling about a task, about a goal. And self-evaluation also really important. So in summary, using LinguaGrow, we have found through the research, increases task value for learners. It increases their motivation to engage with their language learning process, to set goals specific to themselves and to the classes that they're in. And then reflective processes are transferable skills. So that's not only something that is useful inside the language classroom, but also in other aspects of their education, their learning, and life in general. Structural considerations for achieving success with LinguaGrow. We have found that consistent use of the platform is key. So building that really into what you're doing in your classes, in your classroom as regularly as possible. And then training learners in smarter goals. And we'll go over those smarter goals shortly here. Okay, so talking about reflective practice as a transferable skill, that involves this whole these 4 aspects. So specifically, as learners begin to use a platform like this, they may start with goal setting as their first task, and then selecting strategies to reach those goals. Then they will create evidence that show how they're getting to that goal, and then the self-evaluation and reflection part. Now, this circle doesn't only go in one direction. As you can see from all of the arrows that go in various directions on this slide, once learners are comfortable with this process of goal setting, strategy selection, evidence, and reflection, they can jump in at any point and move however long. So maybe they start with, oh, I was talking to a friend in Arabic. This would be great evidence for this specific thing. That ties into this goal that I'm working towards in my class. And then they can reflect on how that is. So it doesn't have to go goal setting, strategy, evidence, reflection. But as learners become more comfortable, they can move around in any in any direction within these 4 things to get to what they are working on. Next. All right, Julie, I will hand it back to you.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to go back just for a minute to that slide previously on the reflective cycle and remind us a little bit. We've seen LinguaGrow. So we see in this reflective cycle, right, these 4 stages. And LinguaGrow, my guess is you've all had some time to look at it already, but is an electronic portfolio to document this. This process can happen if you're using the platform. Also using LinguaGrow as a model for thinking about how to goal set and do that. And so when we talk about grading, the goal is to say, how do I sort of put something in this portfolio, whether I'm doing that digitally, whether I'm doing that on paper, whatever that looks like. Of course, the digital platform that we're talking about makes that easy. It has a mobile upload. You can take pictures of things happening in class, especially with younger learners. Now that we have lots of devices in classrooms to work with after remote learning, it gives us a chance to be able to document that. But the same processes can be applied if you're like, the platform is sort of driving me crazy, but I still want to do reflective practice in that way. And so when we dive into grading, really think about, where do I put sort of value on the grades that I give in each of these kind of 4 areas? And so what we do when we're looking at this then is really work to connect the evidence and measure the growth. And so we want to see evidence, of course, of language learning growth, and we want to think about how we're going to talk about that. And so I'm going to ask you 2 critical questions. And I know I'm asking you to interact, some of you at lunchtime, but even just in the chat, thinking about these 2 questions. 1, who is LinguaGrow for? When you're using an e-portfolio designed for language learning around proficiency goals, who is LinguaGrow for? And when we're talking about what goes in this portfolio system, what actually counts as evidence that you want to grade? And so I know I'm asking you here to interact a little bit and give us something, but go ahead if you can in the chat, or feel free to unmute your microphone. Anyone have one of the 2 answers to, thinking about these questions? Anyone have any ideas? All right, high school students, absolutely. That's really, really key, right? The students, it's for the students in particular. It's not a administrative testing system, right? It's not a way to sort of say, this is for the administration to see how well my students are doing. Instead, it is for students, whether that's high school, whether that's early learning, whether that's university level students. Anyone else? Yeah, and evidence is exactly what they can do, any speaking, any writing, listening, etc. And so what we want to document, and we'll look at this a little more closely as we go through this section, is we want to document not only the perfect products, right? What can they do at the end, which is what we typically grade on tests or in final projects or big high stakes assignments, but we also want to document the process. So sometimes what counts as evidence and ultimately what you want to see are the first stage documents and the growth and reflection that's happening. Also, it gives us absolutely a chance to reflect on our work and reflect on the learning. Let me just look at some of these chats, right? I think it's both for our students to see their own growth, but also for us to inform us as instructors. Absolutely. Kristen, you hit the nail on the head. It's really critical to see how that growth is happening and where they're struggling, where they're not struggling, where they're also perceiving they're struggling and where they may not be struggling. We overwhelmingly see learners under-evaluate their skills as opposed to over-evaluate them. Yeah. Could any task or project that accomplishes any goal? Absolutely. Right. So really it's about what are any of these stages that we can document and that we can work with as we're going along. As such, part of our goal is to often not only, again, document kind of the perfect work, but also the things that go along. And so what we intend to do, and what we're going to talk about today, is in your grading and in your assessment, is ensuring you have learner-directed evidence capture, and you're able to give feedback on the things you want. You're able to guide those goals, and you're able to give feedback while also helping learners capture the things that document their feedback, because that's what we see from the data tells us what can be kind of the most effective as we go along. And so we have kind of two pieces here. One is that feedback is critical, and we want to connect evidence expectations to how feedback will be presented to the learners. And so when we're thinking about grading, we want to ensure we're grading not only the product itself, but their ability to give their own feedback, to reflect on how well they're doing. If we have a learner who says, I'm perfect at this goal, and they're, our target is novice high and we're at the novice low level, well, that's a place where feedback should also be given, because we know that learner-directed regulation really matters. Also, at the same time, encouraging learners to reflect on artifacts that are salient to them and that represent their journey. And so the idea being, we connect then their language learning experience, whether that's in an after-school program, whether that's, multiple times in a course program, whatever that looks like, the domain and the type of language that they're looking at. And so always be thinking about how you can give learner choice in what the evidence is, but then you grade that process as you go along. And we'll look at a number of rubrics as we're working with that. So how do you grade, right? This is the key question. One of the things we talk about a lot when we're talking about portfolio implementation and systems like LinguaGrow is like, great, but what does this mean when I have to give grades to my students? And so we have these 4 kind of steps that we think through that hopefully are useful to you as you're thinking. 1, decide what counts for a grade and what exists purely to provide feedback and guidance. Often, the more we integrate reflective practice, you want to give less grades for each individual step and more grades kind of as a rubric holistically, and we'll look at that. Or it might be when you're first starting out reflectively, you actually want to give points for a learner's willingness to self-reflect, for a learner's ability to be accurate in their assessment, or at least accurate in how they describe their own assessment, etc. Also, devise a mastery rubric to align with LinguaGrow's holistic scale. And so when we think about LinguaGrow, it's aligned around ACTFL and assessable proficiency guidelines, which is a holistic scale, right? It's a way to look at language ability from this big can-do function level. So I can greet people in different contexts. I can say goodbye, I can say hello, I can describe things that happened to me in the past. And as a result, there are certain structures associated with that, certain lexical items, certain cultural functions. And the goal then is to be able to capture that in part of your grading as you look through it as a holistic way, not just sort of grammar points as we go through. Also, we really suggest that you grade reflective processes over artifacts. So for example, a learner who has 4 pieces of evidence showing growth would be a much stronger grade than a learner who shows you a perfect piece of work, because part of the key implementation of e-portfolio systems and reflective practice is that focus on process and a learner's ability to hone in on those skills, which we know over and over again, make them better learners long-term. And better language speakers, actually, better language users, readers, writers, etc. And then another option is we can actually document some of that formative submission, but set those grades to 0% of the grade. In other words, you can start by practicing in low stakes environments as you go through. And so what you'll want to do is pick a combination of these 4, one of these 4, whatever fits with your particular level. If you're in high school, often we find these mastery rubrics number 2 and number 3 to be the most impactful, also to be the most challenging. Something learners learn in school is that what's valued is what my high stakes grade is at the end, right? We have a system where we assign a number and that tells the value. And so what we're asking them to do in this is to improve their learning by focusing less on getting the grade and focusing more on the learning. And so at first, sometimes what we see is a little bit of pushback. However, if implemented consistently, after about 2 weeks, we see tons of growth, and qualitatively from all of our pilot implementations, a lot of excitement about their ability to start showing off their growth and what they're practicing. We have lots of anecdotes where they take it home to show their parents, right? They're so excited to show what's happening in their language classes. And so that's something that becomes really important as you're deciding how to implement this grading in your classroom. And we'll show you some examples. I'll show you some examples here as we go forward. So let's talk a little bit about the mastery rubric and the learner reflection. And we're happy to share these actual documents with you. You can use them, you can adapt them, you can implement them as you see fit. These are ways to accurately and effectively assess both the process and the product, right? It accounts for the product, but also says, and I want to see how well you can develop this over the course of our unit or our week or our learner, our lesson. If you work with elementary school students, an adaptation of this, and we're happy to share this, includes things that are like images where you can use emojis to give their reactions, also just simpler words. And what we know is elementary learners can absolutely do this. We teach every week. Our CASLS goes in and we teach language in an elementary school. And so we do a ton of reflective practice on how they're doing, and they can absolutely do it even at that kindergarten level. So let's look at these mastery rubrics a little bit. I'm going to give you just a minute to read through them so that I don't read you them. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about them. Sorry, I know we're all tired of Zoom, so I'm giving us a little bit of interaction here as we go. All right. Are there any things people notice about either one of these rubrics, things that stick out to you? Then I'll talk about them a little bit. Give you a minute to think. These are both two ways to assess learning and reflection, right? Anything anyone notices? All righty, well, maybe I'll point out a couple things then. One is this first one is a holistic rubric for looking at any task related to interpersonal communication. And so what we ask them to do is say, really think about this particular can-do statement. Oh, here's the chat function, right? You can't read the page on the left. Okay, we will send them so you can see them and make them a little bit bigger. So the first one over here, we have a holistic rubric around interpersonal communication. And the goal is to say, anytime you have a can-do or a task directly related to interpersonal communication, so talking with a peer, working with a colleague, any of those, you can use this type of rubric where you ask learners to self-reflect on the mastery of what they're looking at. In this case, we have 4 categories: clarity of ideas, completeness of ideas, accuracy, which is where we get at grammar, right? And function considerations. And so what their job is to record their interaction, which is the evidence, upload that, and then give a reflection as to why they picked those scores. And so thinking about their strengths when answering and places they want to improve. And then we ask them to set their next SMART goal. So what you grade here is the accuracy of their rubric, if you feel like it's a thoughtful implementation or reflection. And as they get used to using this type of holistic rubric, then they're able to evaluate their own language abilities. And what we mean by function considerations are, for example, if you're learning to say goodbye in Arabic, we don't actually, right, from my understanding anyway, I'm not an Arabic expert, but my understanding is you don't just say goodbye, see you later. right? There has to be at least one or two things that sort of set up the goodbye, what we would call a pre-closer. Or if we're doing invitations, right, there's a way you ensure the invitation feels sincere. And so function considerations relate to really cultural elements, or what we call pragmatic elements, to make sure that you're considering the value of that and not just spitting out kind of textbook words as you go through. Does that answer the question there? All right. Yeah, absolutely. And so what happens then is what you do is use this and attach it to that piece of actual language evidence to start seeing that growth as they go along. Another way to look at that, this is around the novice mid level. And so it gives you how you want to work with each of these areas, what a 4 looks like in function considerations, what a 3 looks like. And so they can use that to kind of fill out this mastery rubric. It's a way to grade the reflective practice on top of the language learning outcomes as well. The alternative, of course, is you giving a score, right, of how well that particular interaction worked. And LinguaGrow is designed to actually extend that evaluation and that grading as you go. Here is another example of a reflection rubric that you can use. Hopefully this one is a little bit bigger to see, and it is easily adapted also for peer review. And so in this case, you're actually evaluating their ability to reflect on their own work. Are they aware of their strengths? Are the learners able to identify 2 or more strengths in their work? Are they aware of their gaps? Can they set those SMART goals? What does that look like? And can they make their own plan for improvement as part of this reflective practice? And so when you're grading, then you can use this rubric to help learners become better learners, right? And so the idea is to utilize systematic evaluation of that to give weight to it, because we know what matters is whatever we grade, right? For learners, it signals whatever sort of that score is. For elementary learners, this might be something simpler that just says, I'm good at this. I need to improve on this. My goal is this, right? And you can start to say how well they're able to do that, circling numbers or emojis, those kinds of things as well. All right, if there are any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and Tigre, you can interrupt me if I don't see it as we go along. Now, some suggested grade conversions as you're thinking about this when you're putting it into a letter grade. Typically, when we're looking at the LFO or the LinguaGrow rating under can do well, this is they finally sort of reached that. You can see the step all the way up. We have a 4-point rubric, or 7-8 goes into an A letter grade. Can do, B, can do with help, etc. As you are scoring their abilities. And again, remember, this is not only your score of their language evidence, but the score on either one of these reflective rubrics or the language mastery rubric of that particular function. And so the idea is that as you really dive into those particular pieces, you can help learners develop how to use these rubrics and how to attach that to particular evidence. What questions do people have at this point? And then we will keep going. All righty, if not, I will keep moving. All right, so the next step then is we know we have these rubrics. We know this, theoretically works in terms of empirical data, but what does it look like in your own context, right? What does this mean for you? How do we really articulate this plan for implementation? And the goal is the next 20 minutes, you kind of thinking through what that looks like for you and how it would work. And what we want to do is really first consider the infrastructure, right? So what tools do you have for evidence upload? What is the duration that you'd like to apply this? The number of times you want learners to upload evidence, the number of times you want learners to reflect, and where and how you want those reflections completed. And so just to give one more reminder and quick overview, LinguaGrow, right, is an e-portfolio system that electronically documents learners' ability to work with these systems And I think you had a lot of sort of pre-information about this. Happy to look at that in more detail if people would like. But then it also has an attached mobile application, so you can capture data, in the classroom on the fly. Learners can upload their evidence straight from their desk, straight from group work, or if you're out on a field trip, they can pull, which I think we might get back to doing someday here. Or when they're exploring on their own, whatever kind of those pieces look like, they can use that as well. So I want you just to take 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes, and just go down this list and think about what you have available, right? What tools are there for evidence? What is the duration you're hoping to apply? Hopefully what we see is application of the ePortfolio across a whole wide variety of days that you're looking at. We know that systemic reflection really matters, but how do you want to do those pieces, and what would that look like in your particular context? So maybe just take a minute on your own to brainstorm. Feel free to type it in the chat or to ask us questions about that as you're thinking through. Three to four times each. Yeah, that's great. Student teacher, I'd like to use it monthly after each unit, maybe 3 to 4 times each semester. Yeah, if you can do every 2 weeks, you'll see sort of stronger benefits of learners getting to do that. It of course depends on, what control you have, but as you sort of move into your own classrooms, what we find is that the more learners get used to doing this, the better off it is for them. And so this is not sort of a optional add-on per se. It's kind of a way of thinking about how you assess and grade their learning process. And the system, the technology component of that, which is sort of a different discussion than what we're doing today, but the actual technical pieces of that facilitate that in pretty easy ways. Although the process can happen whether you use the actual platform or not, right? Which is, here's identifying the goal, that reflective practice cycle that Tigre showed you, right? Here's identifying the goals, here's measuring and reflecting on how well I get there and adjusting those goals accordingly. Yeah, that's great. Other ideas? I use this in my own language classes every day, but not as the ePortfolio system per se, but we do a fist to 5 at the beginning around the learning goals and a fist to 5 at the end. So it means, right, 1 is like, fist is like, I'm doing terrible, I don't understand any of this. 5 is like, yeah, I've got it down. And 3 in the middle, of course, right, that's the scale. And so what we do when we start out is we explicitly look at the class goals for the day. By the end of the day, you should be able to greet 3 different types of people. You should be able to tell someone how you're doing, whatever sort of the function language goals are. And then at the end, we revisit those daily on what's happening. Then weekly is when the ePortfolio reflection happens, either at the very beginning of the week or at the end of the week, depending on sort of how our class schedule aligns, to give them a sense of, now I've done my fist to 5 every day, and now here's the evidence from the week that's showing me what's happening there. So that's how we do those pieces in the language courses that I have taught and worked with. Any other infrastructure or questions where you're saying like, no way, this is never going to work? We can sort of walk through what that might look like. We will keep going then. A couple of evidence collection considerations. So as you're thinking about how you want to keep that evidence happening digitally or otherwise, one is you always want to pick evidence that connects to the learning outcomes. So for example, if the learning outcome is I can give a 1-minute presentational speech, you want that evidence to be a 1-minute presentational speech. Or if it is, I am able to utilize a wide variety of vocabulary to describe another person, you want to show what those descriptions look like, whether that be written or spoken. Learners should actually be the collectors and the uploaders of that evidence as possible, and can also utilize the group work you're doing in class anyway. So if you think about your communicative tasks that you're working with, when you have learners utilize their group work, you can use that as the evidence that they should upload as well. Here are a couple of tips when we're talking about connecting that evidence to learning outcomes. Reminding learners of the can-do statements at the beginning of class, during activities related to can-do statements, and during upload. So having them consistently revisit what those goals and functional goals look like. Also consider that LinguaGrow is designed to promote this self-direction and growth, and therefore goal setting and reflection is correlated with language outcomes when considering grades. And so part of success is the ability to reflect on my own ability to grade or to make apologies, whatever that looks like. And then have learners actually mark their evidence with the related can-do statements. So once the evidence has been picked, which can-do statement are they intending to show you? One trick is when we're documenting reading, for example, or listening. Anyone have any ideas on what evidence for documenting reading or listening might look like? Yeah, time set reading can work, absolutely. Comprehension questions can work as long as the reflection is about how well the learners were able to feel like they could comprehend, as opposed to the success of the written responses in those particular places, right? So that becomes critical when doing that. Yeah, time spent reading is great. The other thing we do is have learners take a picture of the book and say, I read this, these are my 3 key outcomes, or this is what I learned. This is what I really liked about this story, right? A reading log can be really effective, especially for elementary learners. And so anything that sort of documents that can be a helpful way to get at that evidence. Yeah, having them create questions from the reading can be great. If we're always measuring learners read, yeah, orally is perfect, right? If we're always measuring learners' ability to read or listen by what they can produce, then we're actually still giving evidence of production. So we want to be sure we give a variety of ways to sort of capture what that evidence looks like. Yeah, any other ideas? All right. The other thing then that we think about often is learner ownership, right? And so whenever possible, having learners select the evidence that they should upload. What we find are elementary and middle school learners are actually much better at this than high school and higher ed learners. They like to show off what's happening. Whereas by the time we get later in an educational system, they're waiting for instructions, right? They want to be sure that they have exactly what's supposed to fit into that system. And so part of what happens with older learners then is teaching them how to take that ownership back of their own learning and how to say, these are the things I really care about. Learners should be in charge of collecting their evidence. The technical infrastructure will, of course, determine the frequency of uploads. If you have a set of iPads or iPods or computers, Google Classroom in your classroom, that you can do it more often, right? But if you don't have access to that technical infrastructure in any way, a physical file folder allows learners to collect over the course of the week and then select and curate and upload as homework or upload when you go to the lab if that immediate uploading isn't possible. And then finally, having learners reflect in a variety of ways why they selected the evidence, and having them upload the rubric that we saw before as well. So including both of those pieces can be a really helpful way to give learner ownership. Also, use your group work. Group work is a great way to enhance the reflective practice. One of the questions we often get asked is, well, what about staying in the target language, which is absolutely essential at every point we can. But what we know is also that at the end of an activity or when they're working on something, giving them a chance to spend 5 minutes in a language that feels comfortable to them, doing some deep reflection on their language abilities, enhances the L2 proficiency as you go. And so in this case, doing peer review sessions, having them practice doing that self-reflection with each other, and then having them compare and contrast their self-evaluation of what they did with their peers' evaluation. Often their peers are much more generous, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, but it gives them a chance to talk about what those differences look like, which is the language learning skill we're talking about. Sometimes we get so focused on kind of that L2. The goal here is actually to be able to reflect, because we know long-term that improves the other types of skills as well. And then from that group work, one evidence sample can be created and each person can upload it to their own portfolio, right? So they can actually document that group work and that reflective practice as they're working on their own portfolios and as they go through. Here is an implementation, a sample plan for a teacher-directed evidence capture that happens regularly every 5 days. And so what we wanted to give you is, what does this really look like in practice as you're grading and reflecting? And so we have a can-do statement for each day. For example, on day 5, the can-do statement is, I can have introductory conversations with people I just meet in culturally appropriate ways. Then the reflectional and goal setting activity associated with that particular goal is peer evaluation using a handout to guide reflection. One of those 2 mastery rubrics we looked at, it could be something more specific. And then the approach to the upload would be an audio file is recorded, captured, and uploaded with the app in the classroom, and or if you use a course management system, you can record that way and then link to that. And then students upload individually to show what's happening there. Then 5 days later, they're working on presenting introductory information about my family in culturally appropriate ways. The distinction, of course, being people you just meet versus your family. And this time it's a self-evaluation using the handout to guide. So in day 5, we had a peer. In day 10, we had a self-evaluation. And then in this case, it's a video file that's captured by the teacher and uploaded to a computer lab, a computer file in the lab. And then students can rotate in and out to give, 5 in groups of 5 to minimize bandwidth issues. So the idea is to give you some examples here that would apply to whatever sort of context you're in and whatever technology you have available to you. You can see then day 15, we go back to peer reflection and review. And so the idea is that attached to each kind of principle can do is a chance for the self-reflection and evaluation as you're going through. Are there any questions on that piece? Those of you working in elementary environments, this happens a lot with Seesaw. Seesaw is a learning management platform that gets used pretty thoroughly throughout. And so it would be very similar to the work that's happening there. You can also attach Seesaw links right in LinguaGrow. And so learners' work can be kind of placed in both spots if that's what's happening in your particular context. I know we have lots of levels here today. All right, any questions or comments? All right, so I'm gonna ask you, we have about 3 minutes before we take a break. See if you can come up with one can-do statement that you're working with and what one reflection or goal setting activity would be and how you would want to kind of upload that into your own context. You're welcome to share that with us, or again, I will just be quiet and give you a little bit of time to think using this particular template. I know we're all in kind of different environments right now as we're connecting here. So I'll give you just a minute to do that. LinguaGrow platform. Nora had a question about the LinguaGrow platform in particular. We are happy to set up test accounts for anyone who has them. Some of you already have them, I believe, as you're working. We are happy to set up a trial account. They're not free all the way through. And so that's why we focus on the pedagogy piece here. This can happen regardless of the use of the platform as you're working with it. It's not a high cost platform by any means, but just so you know, that's a reality. I also wanted to ask, as you're working on these implementation, would it be helpful if we started hour 2 or ended the second hour with sort of just a tour of the platform itself? I know we sent that out ahead of time, but I'm wondering if it would be helpful to have a little bit more insight on the actual technical tool as well. I know today is really on pedagogy and assessment and those pieces, but let us know in the chat if that would be helpful. We can kind of regroup just a little bit. All right, let's see. We have another example here. Watch a minute clip silently, then narrate the actions in the target language by writing it using verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Connectors use the rubric to weigh the student production. Awesome. And that could be then, the function is presentational narration, right? Students can narrate a story of what's happening. Yeah, great. Awesome. All right, I can see maybe we want a little bit of an overview about LinguaGrow and LinguaFolio as a platform too. So we'll add that in and see as we go. All right, perfect. All right, any other implementation ideas or things people have been thinking about? All righty. Well, with that, we will take, I think, a 5-minute break and answer any questions that people have. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, connecting it to kind of Flipgrid and weather and some of the things there. Absolutely. Any other questions, as that's our first hour? We'll give you a 5-minute break until 10:05, and then we will come back together. We'll, of course, stick on. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or ask us while we're here, and we will see you all at 10:05. There. Before we dive into hour 2, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, I know we sent this ahead of time. I think some of you have already seen this version, but just to make sure, and apologies if this was unfamiliar ahead of time, but let me go ahead and just share what this looks like. This is the learner side. So what we have is, it's still LinguaFolio up here. LinguaGrow is sort of the new version that's up and coming as we're revising it. But the idea is that for each learner, they have what we call, this is a strange looking one because it's our test account, but what they have is they have a proficiency overview around the 4 modes of communication related to, of course, the necessful, actful standards. And what happens within each mode is they have pieces of evidence then where they actually can reflect and work with these particular can-do statements. So what this particular student has done is they're working on different goals related to whichever kind of level. In this case, they're looking at novice, mid, interpersonal communication. And then they work on rating themselves and uploading evidence directly related to whatever particular can-do statement they're working on. When they have that evidence uploaded, then they can find it here and they can work with it and they can add to it. And then I'll show you the teacher side in a minute. What you as a teacher can do then is see each of those particular profiles as they build and as they go. This one looks strange because these are just sample, right, pieces. It tells us down here, you can see on the bottom right, interpersonal, where, you know, they've reached about 27.8% of those goals as they go through. We have 6 pieces of evidence and they can work with those particular pieces then, and you can go in and see those can-dos. We could spend kind of hours on different functionality related to this. But this is kind of a general overview. Also, what can happen is you can assign particular assignments and tasks that you can use for that particular upload. Please record a 1-minute presentation in which you tell us about whether in a country that speaks the language you're learning. And then that evidence gets directly tied to those particular functions and those particular spaces. And you can also put together a set of what we call can-do clusters. And a can-do cluster is directly related to the can-do statements you want to work on for your particular group. In this case, we are looking at weather and travel. And so there were 2 sets of goals around interpretive communication, spoken, viewed, and sign language at the intermediate level, and then presentational communication, speaking and sign at that particular level. And so the idea then is this portfolio comes together, it has all these different pieces of evidence and language. And as a learner progresses, what typically happens is this middle novice low gets filled up first, and then novice mid and novice high. And you can start to see their growth in different modes and different levels of communication. Or if you start to see an imbalanced growth in interpersonal and not enough in presentational or not enough in listening, then it gives you as a teacher a chance to focus in on each of those learners' particular skills. It also walks learners through the proficiency process. We'll just do a test upload so you can see here. You can pick the language, and then it asks them to associate their evidence either with one of the tasks you're working on, with a can-do cluster, or with all of the can-dos. We're just going to pick our weather and travel task. And this one is going to be a listening one, even though I picked text. And it gives examples of what level we're at. This is having learners figure out how to identify their own mode of communication. From there, then we ask them to think about if they're at intermediate mid, and it gives them descriptors so that they start to, again, do this reflective process built right into the particular system. This also can be an upload of those rubrics that we showed you in the first hour. It then asks them to pick the can-do statement directly associated. In this case, I can understand the main idea and key information in short, straightforward informational texts. They click on that particular can-do statement, and then we can get to how well are you doing? It's a goal. I can do this with help. And they go forward. They have then their evidence up here. This is, of course, just a test one, but they have their evidence here, and it shows where they are and how they are in that reflective process. They save and submit, and then that evidence becomes part of that particular profile, regenerates it as they're working through. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about uploading and working with that evidence. The resources that you were sent prior to the workshop walk through a bunch of these different steps, a bunch of the tutorials as well. And so happy to dive into that more, but wanted to kind of show you what that looks like. I will also pull up the teacher account. Hopefully, let me see if I can log out here. We'll try this and make sure this works. This wasn't on our agenda, but it seems like we might need it. So. Oh, they don't like that one. It doesn't like that one. So I will keep working on the teacher side so we can show you that, even though that wasn't our original plan here as we're going. Basically, what you can see are the profiles for all of the different students as they're working through that particular piece. So I will work on that so we can look at the teacher side at the end. But you can see your class together. You can see how well they're doing on the uploads, those kind of pieces. So feel free to check that out. There's a quick and basic overview on that. Wasn't our goal for today, but super happy to also share those, and the resources that we sent have a bunch of resources on the platform and the technology itself. So what we find is people who understand the pedagogy really find this effective and really work with it, which is why we spend so much time on what does the research tell us, how do we think about goal setting, and then the tool becomes fairly straightforward. It's like, oh yeah, this will capture everything. And so happy to talk more about the technical pieces at the end as well. Alrighty, so let's dive back into our where we were at for the second half. We want to go back here. And so just a reminder of what our goal is for the second half, and we'll probably shorten this just a little because we want to be really mindful of your time as well, but revisiting reflective practice with goals and connecting that. Can everyone see that? I hope. Am I sharing? No. We good? One more second. All right, there we go. So really thinking about our overview for what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes. The idea is revisiting that reflective practice cycle and connecting goals with evidence. Identifying at least one approach that you can use for involving learners in that goal setting process, and then explaining best practices associated with providing feedback and how you want to do that. And so we'll talk a little bit about each of those as we go through. Of course, we can leave some time at the end also if people have technical questions or want to understand kind of the nitty-gritty of the tool itself. So let's revisit and think about what some of these look like. So again, if you remember nothing else from today, is this the reflective practice cycle as a way to identify your goals as proficiency-oriented goals, thinking about those goal setting practices. Is it talking about the weather? Is it narrating a story? Is it, you've already identified a number of those functions, selecting strategies to give learners the opportunity to self-evaluate and reflect and really understand what those goals mean to them at their proficiency level. Then creating evidence and documenting that process as a continual ongoing process. Again, it doesn't have to go step by step. It can happen in every direction. But as you think about your own classrooms, whether it's elementary, middle school, high school, or university, is how do I integrate this reflective practice? LinguaGrow is a tool that really helps facilitate that because it's designed for language learning. It already identifies the can-do statements and the goals. It already talks about the functions. But any way that you can get at this reflective practice is going to be effective. We, of course, built the tool because we want it to be an easy way to do this work, but it doesn't have to be. This can be paper, pencil. It can be, any other sort of learning management system that you're working with as you go through. So if that's all you sort of take from today, that would be our hope as well. One way that you do this probably already, but is the exit ticket. You can actually have an exit ticket for every single day. This is an example for higher level learners. For younger kids, it can even be like, tell me on your way out, give me the greeting, right? Speak the Arabic, do whatever you need to do. Even in my graduate courses, I use an exit ticket minute paper. What's the one thing you learned today? Where are you still struggling? And that can be used as evidence of this reflective practice as well. So let's dive into some goal setting now, and I will turn it back over to Tigre to make sure we're on the same page about goals and language learning goals and the proficiency guidelines and ways that we think about goal setting in this reflective practice.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Next slide. So when we're thinking about goal setting, especially in terms of setting up reflective practices, what we're really thinking about is helping learners think about thinking, helping learners devise strategies for how to think and learn on their own terms. So one context you may have heard about in terms of thinking about thinking is this visual thinking project from Project Zero at Harvard. So this is 3 steps. So first, what do you see? What do you think about what you see? So what do you see? What can you observe? What do you think about what you see? So what connections can you make about what you're observing? And then what do you wonder about what you see? So what do these connections make you question? What comes up when you're making connections based on your observations? Next. Okay. And then we also want to talk about sort of types of goals. So what are we really trying to do? What types of goals are we trying to reach with our reflective practices? So there are 2 main types of goals here: mastery and performance. So looking at these 2 lists, so what did I master and what did I perform? Which of these goals do you think are often set as the standard in our educational systems? You can shout it out or type in the chat. Which do we see more often? Nora says performance. Right. So how did I perform? What grade did students get? Julie talked before, especially in high school, college learners, once they've been trained in our educational systems, they focus really on what do I need to do to get a grade, right? So looking at performance rather than mastery. And so what we're looking with reflective goals is shifting that towards master. So what did I master? Looking at mastery fosters achievement. It establishes patterns of behavior and skill development. So we're really looking not can students say a specific thing using one specific word, but really what does using that vocabulary word, what does using the things they've been learning in class help them do with language? And it also contributes to growth mindset. So the effort is what improves the outcome. The actual specific outcome may or may not be the goal. It's really the effort here that's the goal. Next. Okay, so we talked briefly about, well, I mentioned SMART goals, but we didn't go over what they are yet. So we're going to get into that now. Next. So this comes from Doran in 1981, talking about setting goals and how this is originally made for business and management practices, but actually applies well to language learning and learning in general as well. So how do we set goals that are useful to our students in terms of their learning goals, to us in terms of our teaching goals and pedagogical goals? So SMART goals is one way to think of that. So it's an acronym for goals must be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So goals that are specific really narrow in on what exactly you are wanting your learners to do. What basically making them as specific as possible will help your learners understand what they are supposed to be doing. Measurable, so can learners produce output that shows that they've reached that goal or that they are working towards that goal? This also in terms of reflective practices, can they show their how they're reflecting on their process and working towards the goals? Achievable, is this goal appropriate for your students' proficiency level, age, learning level, context? Relevant in terms of reflective practices that we're talking about here. Is the goal relevant to what your learners want to do with language? Is it relevant to where they're trying to get to with their language learning and language use? And then time-bound, is the goal achievable within the time frame that you are setting for it? And is that time frame clear to your learners? Next. Okay, so to make these goals, to really build in that reflective practice that we've been talking about, we talk about smarter goals. So taking our SMART goals and then adding in more of reflection. Next. So this comes from Mollier, Thieler, and Wu from 2012. This was a longitudinal study, and this used the SMART goals, but also added in evaluation and reflective pieces to really provide more depth to that reflective process. How can we really get it to work in our classrooms and settings? And what the study found was that there was a correlational positive relationship between the components of the goal setting process. So each component of that goal setting cycle that we've talked about a couple times. So identifying goals, strategies, reflections, and stamp scores. So language proficiency test scores. So that means as students are working with all of these, working with and using components of goal setting processes, more often their stamp scores also improved. Next. Okay, and so how do we use these smarter goals specifically when we're talking about LinguaGrow as a platform? How are these built into what LinguaGrow is and how we use it? So in terms of specific goals, these come from our necessful, actful, can-do statements. So each of those statements names a very specific thing that learners can do with language. In terms of goals being measurable, this is captured in that 5-point scale, the reflective scale that Julie showed you that learners will have to fill out as they upload their evidence. So this is a goal, can do with help, can do, and can do well, 4-point scale, sorry. In terms of achievable goals, this is built into LinguaGrow through sub-proficiency levels. So everything is really broken down into the can-do statements underneath the different proficiency levels, and the sub-proficiency levels, so low, medium, and advanced, really break it down even into more detail. For relevant goals, you are able to type in customized can-do statements. So you can use the ones that are already uploaded there, the necessal actful ones, but you can also really use whatever you are, type in whatever can-do statements you're working on in your context. So if there's something that you're working on that doesn't exactly match to the can-do statements that are already there, you can type in your own ones and make it really relevant to your situation. In terms of time bound, we find that in the can-do clusters and assignments. So we're using the can-do statements in very specific ways, either to complete assignments or to complete with can-do clusters a larger swath of a group of assignments or a course unit, things like that. Evaluation, learners will evaluate how they performed when they're selecting each achievement level. So again, they get to say how, or they have a chance to say, evaluate how they did. And then reflection, the reflection either is built in and uploaded when you're uploading evidence, or there can be external reflections. So like Julie was talking about before, doing things with pen and pencil is fine. There's a lot of ways to build that reflection, and it can be in the platform or out of the platform. The importance there is to do the reflective part, not exactly where it's done. It's doing it and doing it consistently. Next. And then I'll pass it back to Julie.
Thank you, Tigre. Before we start moving into students and the goal setting process, I'm curious, what can-do statements are you all focusing on? What do you find difficult about the can-do statements as you're working with them? That's really key to any kind of sort of reflective practice or function as you're building in. Does anyone have some ideas about how they're using the can-do statements and some of those proficiency pieces or questions they have about that particular piece? Often it's not how our textbooks are written, right? Or it's not how materials are made available. We sort of have focuses on things like grammar points or skills. And so making sure that can-do statement stuff is integrated can be really, really important. Any questions or concerns in that area? All right. Well, I'll let you put those in the chat if there are, as you're thinking through them as we go. All right, so how do we involve students in the goal setting process? Part of is them understanding the can-do statements and kind of rethinking their own thinking about language learning, making sure that they have a chance to kind of think about that. And our goal is to, we call it practice, play, and introduce. And so the activity example is something like, I can do it. And so learners create, and this is a task to really introduce this idea of goal setting and learner-directed goals. What learners do is you have them create an example of a task they do in their normal lives and explain how each level of achievement might be evidenced. So something they're really good at that might or might not be language related as they're working through, right? And so that becomes really, really important for them to really start thinking about and then diving into that. Okay, cool. How does that transfer to language? What do you do with those particular pieces? And so using something like this can help them start to identify both those measurements as they go through, as well as some of the types of things we might think about in terms of function. Another example is how will I prove it, right? So when engaging in the reflective process, we also want learners to think about what counts as evidence. So we did a practice one with my daughter, she's in 3rd grade, to try this out. And so we asked her to do the first one. We said, hey, pick a task. She's been working on skateboarding, so she got a new skateboard and she wanted to figure it out. And so her goal was a certain trick. And then she wanted to show evidence of how she'd improved, right, on pedaling and some of the things that she was working on. And so walking through then, now that you have your goal, what do you need to show off what that is? Is it a video? Is it a picture? Is it something? And then jumping to having them do that with something related to language. Okay, great. You know how to do this in this area of your life. What does that look like for language as you're going through? Also making sure the evidence reflects both their strengths as well as the goals and the ways that they want to work with that. For university level or high school students, it's sort of using these actual questions and then having them share with each other other ideas that they might have about how they can prove some of their language abilities going through. Here is a brainstorming guide, and in the links that we sent, these are available as well as actual activities. We can send them separately also. But this is a template you can use with learners. One is first having them brainstorm some ways to learn a new language. We give them some categories. We have them highlight and put stars by things that would be really helpful. And then have them move those into their goal activities, think about why they chose them, and documenting here in this third column, how will I know I performed or how well I performed, right? And so it gives them some samples and some ways to think about that. These can also be directly related to the unit and the content of your course. And instead of having them be like listening, reading, speaking, which are the general categories we gave so that they're useful for a wide variety of contexts, you can actually have those be the topics you are particularly interested in. There was a question in the chat of if those are actually built into LinguaGrow, and the answer is kind of and kind of not. So they are built into LinguaGrow around the can-do statement. So if you're working directly with the necessful, actful, can-do statements as your organizing principle, that is all pre-built in, it's pre-populated, it's there. But if not, if you want something like what we showed you around weather and travel, those are actually custom built. You build them once as the teacher, and then that gets deployed to all of your students. So you can build a different group of can-dos each week. You could build a different group each month, whatever sort of makes sense to you, so that it's really, really customized to your particular context, making it very, very kind of those sub goals very achievable. You can also modify and create custom can-dos. Instead of saying, I can greet people, you could add cultural elements, or you could add, I can greet people doing in these ways or in this particular context. And so that gives you a chance to work with that. Also in different varieties of Arabic, if you're talking about advanced level learners, right? If they want to be able to do kind of sort of standard work as well as different dialects that they're working in, depending on, again, your context, your interest, your needs for those particular learners. So I think that answers the question as well. So getting learners to start brainstorming, using guides and templates to be able to do that can be really helpful. We will absolutely share this PowerPoint, and these handouts are available. And happy to talk about, sorry, I'm just checking the chat questions as we move. LinguaGrow is both browser and app based. So it is a platform, yeah, that can be used across the board, both in a browser space as well as an app on a mobile device. Not all functionality shows up on the mobile device, but it works really well for evidence upload and kind of checking where you're at. And we'll send out those links again to all of these resources. I think they went out in the beginning when you got the agenda and those, but we'll send them again so you can dive into this. And I'll show you at the end here a resource that I think might even be more helpful on the technical side of what those particular pieces look like. All right, perfect. So other thing we think about are strategies. And so if you're not sort of doing strategies work already, we offer a strategies guide. Here are some ways you can increase your exposure. Here are some ways about learning new sounds. Here's some strategies for preparing to listen. And so the goal is that learners start to think about not only kind of how they're doing based on what they're learning in your classes, but they're also thinking about, well, I want to do better in this piece. I could do these things outside of the classroom. And in doing so, as they set their own goals, as it starts to become this kind of learner-driven growth, we see them doing more work outside of the classroom, which is ultimately kind of what we're looking for anyway as we go through. Also, we have lots of ways to do goal personalization. And so having them, again, take an inventory of what's important to them, and then providing a can-do statement related to those curricular needs. So whatever your goal is for the week, and then having them think about how they could work with that. So let's just say your can-do statement is, I can ask a neighbor to borrow supplies. What you can do is, maybe a student is interested in war history. What kind of supplies would they want to buy? Or a student interested in video games or cooking, right? So they can sort of extend that particular activity and that particular space to their own personalization needs. So if we say, I can greet people in a variety of contexts, they might say, I can greet a stranger and my grandparents. Right. And so the idea is to help them think about how they can personalize the goals that you have for them in the classroom anyway. We'll send this out so you have this link. This is another activity that you can work with through your students. It's a template that is there to do. With that, we want to give a special thanks, and we want to have time for questions, and we want to have time to dig into some of these questions about the platform. And so first I'll start with some general questions, and then we want to show you some additional resources that we can work with and you can work with as you're implementing these in your particular context. So maybe I'll just start if there are any general questions that people have as we're going through and as we're really diving into these pieces. I'll give you a chance to type it into the chat here, which it seems like it might be a tiny bit delayed because I keep jumping the gun on you all. All righty. Alrighty, so I'm going to direct you to 3 particular links, and we will put these in the chat as well. So the first one is, and this one we sent out prior to the workshop as well. I'm not sure, I'm guessing most of us haven't had time. It's a really crazy time in everyone's lives. We know that. So this is I'll also put the link in the chat for you. This is a website that has a bunch of resources on how to do this work, both for teachers, how to use it. So we have kind of an about focus. LinguaFolio, again, is the current version. LinguaGrow will be the new version. It sort of walks you through what this pedagogy, it reminds you of the things that we looked at today. But then we have a whole bunch of resources on the technical pieces of this. So it walks you through on how to get started, how to introduce it to your students, what the different resources are there. It's just basically a summary of the pieces we looked at today. What I really like about this one is there's also a module for learners. So how do you start working with this at home? And there are a number of embedded YouTube videos about how do you think about autonomous learning. All of the brainstorming guides that we talked about, I'll put the direct link to this unit in there as well. All of those brainstorming guides that we showed you in the PowerPoint are right here for download, and they're downloadable so that you can change them if you need to, as well as some of our own ideas as they're going through. And then how do you know what goals to set? This really is, what is proficiency? What is language learning? What is my strategy? How am I going to get better? What knowledge do I need to complete these goals? How do we know that it comes this way? What resources can I do? And so it walks them through all of this process of reflective goal setting that they can then use related to those particular sets and platforms, etc. I'll also send you to, this is the actual URL to start working more with the platform. We are happy to give everyone in this workshop a trial. If you want to try it out, just send, you can just actually pop your email in the chat if you'd like a free trial. It is a paid platform. It's not very much. It's $2 per student per year. That really just covers our server cost and any technical development. We don't actually make any money off of it. It's just the way that we maintain it as we go through, of course, because we're a research center nonprofit. And so if you would like to have a free trial, you can either email us afterwards, you can let Mimi know and she can get in touch with us, or we are happy to share that as needed. So those are some of the key features that we have, and we have about 20 minutes left for questions or interaction. I also am very cautious of your time, and Mimi said sort of wherever we land is great. And so I just want to check what other things would people like to see? What other questions do you have? What other resources can we offer you? I'm going to give you one more here. I'm going to direct you to one more slightly more general resource, but I think it's directly related to all the things we were talking about today. We have a library of learner-focused activities on how to get better at language. And so if you go to this is the YouTube channel, you can find there's about now almost 300 videos on how to be a better listener, how to think about culture, how to think about less commonly taught languages. And there are examples of a whole bunch of different languages there. And so this can directly relate to evidence, how to tie into the goal setting piece, and all of those as well. And with that, we will leave it for questions. And Mimi, I'll kind of turn it back over to you, but also happy to answer or offer resources as we go.
One more thing, Julie, before we turn it back over to Mimi, I'm going to put the email address to contact us if you have any questions about Linguafolio or LinguaGrow, and also our phone number at CASLS. So you're welcome to call us and leave a voicemail. We're happy to answer emails or voicemail questions at any point. So definitely feel free to reach out as questions come up, and we're happy to work with you on what you're working on.
Thank you so much, Julie and Tigre. I'll pause here as well, just for a little bit to see if anyone has questions for, that you can write, of course, in the chat, or just, unmute yourself and go ahead. Yeah, so I'll pause for a second. Okay. All right. Well, it looks like everyone is thanking you both. And I want to do that too. Oh, wait, there is a question that looks like here. And Julie and Tigre, you can see that, I think, in the chat. Yeah. How can we set mastery goals rather than a performance goal from can-do statements?
Yeah. Tigre, do you want me to answer? Do you want to answer? Okay, so the can-do statements themselves are mastery goals. The key is not to turn the can-do statements into performance goals, right? So often what happens is we say something like the can-do statement might, let's just pick a basic one. I can greet people in a variety of languages. Then the performance goal becomes, I can get an A on my greeting homework. I can pass a test. I can do that. And so the goal is to ensure you're always measuring that mastery at that proficiency level, and not the sort of discrete point. Here's the way they can do the words, they can do all of those pieces, right? And so that is, the key is not to turn them back into performance goals, which is what we see actually in lots and lots of instances. So if you use the can-do statements as they are, or even customize them to your context, they are very, very clearly mastery goals. Yeah, any other questions? And again, we're available. So we normally do about 12 hours of training on LinguaGrow and LinguaFolio. So this is your very quick fire hose overview of all of the major pieces. But a lot of these resources are online as well. And and Tigre is happy to answer them as we go. And Stephanie Knight, our assistant director at CASLS, she will be back. She's on leave now, but she'll be back soon, and she's great as well. So she or Tigre can answer.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, you really, even though it was, abbreviated, as you said, I think you really gave a wonderful overview and a real sense of LinguaGrow, the tool itself, and thank you for that, adding that in, but of course the pedagogy behind it. So just to say to those who are left on, the resources, the links that were sent out before the workshop or with the Zoom link, and I will send those again just so you have them, when I follow up with you afterwards in the next day or two. And yeah, I think that's it from our side. Again, I'll send a survey out as well, and you'll be hearing from me. And thank you so much for attending, and thanks to our presenters again.
Thank you very much for having us.